Ladies and gentlemen, we might make a start. My name is Noel Bean. I work with the ABC generally, working in our specialist religion and ethics department. We work on radio and television, trying to make sense out of, there's a bishop there too. We try to make some sense out of religion and ethics and what people believe, what they feel, what their culture is about, and how that might affect public policy and the interrelationship. So, of course, I personally find the idea of getting some sort of understanding of these two countries, Egypt and Turkey, and what's behind the transitions going on there, really personally very interesting. You've got two speakers here today who are going to give a fist in 25 minutes trying to explain to you what's happening in Turkey, what's happening in Egypt. We'd all be aware, of course, that there are journalists currently detained in Egypt, in the trouble there. There's an Australian imprisoned. You've been seeing reports of disturbance and civil actions in Egypt. You've probably heard of the minority groups, the Copts, who are very large in terms of minority groups within Egypt, and how that's fitting in the mix, the tensions there. You would also be aware of Taksim Square. You'd also be aware, perhaps, of a purge that has just gone on in Turkey, which has targeted the Gulenist movement. Our two speakers today, let me introduce them. Associate Professor Ihsan Yilmaz, here on my left, an Associate Professor of Political Science at Faith University in Istanbul. He was an Oxford Fellow between 1999 and 2001, taught Turkish government and politics there, legal sociology, comparative law, Islamic law. So we're talking about somebody who is very interested in Muslim law and states. I heard him yesterday. I was fortunate enough to be at a round table with journalists listening to his take on how and why Turkey is behaving and reacting the way it is at the moment. And it's a little hard for those of us for whom I think our last political coup was the Rum Rebellion. That's a long time ago, to understand why these things are happening and how they happen. Next will be Dr. Anthony John Billingsley. Dr. Billingsley is a lecturer in international relations at the School of Social Sciences, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales. His main focus has been the Middle East and international law, and he looks at things like political succession in the Arab world. So we have somebody for the Turks, somebody for the Arabs, and they'll keep it separate, if that's okay with you, and then we'll throw over to questions for you and those things that you might want to know and ask them. So first up, I'd like to ask Dr. Billingsley to tell us something about what's going on in Egypt and to try to make a fist of that for us.
Well, good evening, everyone. I first of all like to thank Mr. Keskin for the invitation to take part in this panel tonight. I think there's always a need for groups such as the Affinity Intercultural Foundation to challenge prejudice and misunderstandings, and I think this is particularly true given the way in which events overseas impact different communities in Australia, all of us. The topic that Professor Yilmaz and I have been asked to talk about is of extraordinary importance and extraordinary interest, I think. And I should note that if Professor Yilmaz was not here tonight, I would be making frequent reference to Turkey, but as we've heard, there's a strict division of labour tonight, so my focus is going to be specifically on Egypt. And I should apologise in advance if my comments on what's going on in Egypt are particularly pessimistic or angry, but I am. And so that will be reflected, I think, in my remarks. I've lived in Egypt and I'm very fond of the place, and what I see happening there is, I find distressing. So we have a region which is experiencing absolutely extraordinary turmoil and has been over a period of 3 years. I have been following the Middle East, well, for nearly 60 years, and I cannot remember a time, even after the Six-Day War in 1967, when we've had so much chaos, so much uncertainty running through the region, so much disruption to people's daily lives as we're experiencing now. In every country in the region, I think we're seeing turmoil stretching from Morocco in the west through to, well, be arbitrary, but through to Iran in the east. Every country has been challenged by old certainties being questioned, people displaying quite evidently their desperation, their frustration with the way things have developed over the past 20 years or so. And even those governments that have managed to avoid direct challenge, governments such as the Saudis perhaps, or the Moroccans, they're still, I think, running scared. They're still worried about the groundswell of protest that's been bubbling along. And they've resorted to all sorts of measures, ranging from repression through to financial inducements to keep the population down. Now, the excitement, I remember the excitement. I was doing an interview with the ABC in, I think it was the 25th of February 2011, and the crowd in Tahrir Square were going, "Roh, roh," when Mubarak was going to give a big speech on a big screen in Tahrir Square. And we all thought, this is it. The man is going, a new dawn is arriving, we're going to have this wonderful democratic experiment in Egypt. Well, since then, the achievements have been drawn back, been ground back. The rulers in these countries have regained their balance, if you like, that the people who initially had perhaps questioned their determination to rule have regained that determination. And I think we've then seen, of course, the brushing aside, especially in Egypt, of the reformers. Reformers of all types, secular, religious, and I want to get back to that distinction later. But brushed aside, first of all, by a fumbling Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan, and then, of course, by its repression by the military since. And repression, I think, by a regime which is perhaps more extreme than any regime that the Egyptians have experienced, at least since independence. Now, the fight back, if you like, has been led to a great extent by the Saudis. The Saudis, I think, have been faced with real panic for a whole number of reasons. One, because they can't see, they don't like what they see in terms of American relationships with Iran, but also because they've found that their great wealth does not necessarily translate into real control over events in the region. And I could add in this respect that the Israelis, with their great military power, have also been frustrated by the same thing. They weren't able to stop people getting out into the streets and trying to change things. And so we've had the Saudi intervention in Bahrain, the extraordinary proposal that Morocco and Jordan join the Gulf Cooperation Council, which I guess becomes a council of kings rather than a regional group. We've seen the Saudis supporting with material, arms, manpower, money, some of the most extreme groups in the Syrian civil war. And we've seen the Saudis trying to unite all the members of the Gulf into some anti-Iranian coalition, fortunately, in my view, thwarted by Oman. And now we're seeing the Saudis beating the Qataris into line. Out of the events that I've been touching on, I think one of the significant elements has been the rise of religion, at least in a symbolic sense, in Middle Eastern politics. And what has developed, I think, has been a conflict between the Muslim Brotherhood, and my remarks are really focusing on the Ikhwan, on the Muslim Brotherhood, which I tend to regard, at least in the last 20 years, as a force for moderation in the region, a force of pragmatism in the region, against establishment groups, the elite groups in the Gulf in particular, who are willing to tie their stars to wagons of groups whose message is much more focused on religious extremism, political extremism, and intolerance. Now, it seems to me unremarkable that in Egypt in particular, the Muslim Brotherhood should have benefited from the removal of the Mubarak regime. We have a region in which 90% of the population, I don't know exactly what the statistic is Muslim. What that means is that, to me, when you start to see movement at the base, that feelings associated with Islam are going to start rising to the surface. And I think this is exactly what happens in Egypt. And I think, looking down the track, if we're ever going to find stability in Egypt, the regime, the government system that emerges is going to have some sort of religious coloration, Islamic coloration, if you like. And that's, I don't think, remarkable. If you look at the Western experience, there are party after party called Christian Democrats through Europe. We have the rise of the religious right, partly because of the failure of many of the reformers, the young people in particular, to establish, if you like, coherent agendas that might mean something to the people. They sounded good to Western audiences, perhaps, and they sounded good maybe in elite groups, but they didn't actually get traction with people down in Asyut or in some of the more remote parts of the country. They've also failed to produce leaders who I think have credibility in that sort of audience. Men like Mohammed al-Baradei and Amr Musa are, I should insist, admirable men. Mohammed al-Baradei has served Egypt and the international community with distinction. But I don't think they're the men for the occasion. I think we need somebody who is younger and more, perhaps, assertive. And those people haven't emerged, at least as yet. The Ikhwan's rise also, I think, is the logical consequence of deep-seated and long-lasting frustrations on the part of millions of Egyptians who many years have felt themselves excluded from government, excluded from access to the people who are meant to represent them, denied a voice, and just generally ignored by Cairo. The Brotherhood has been able to exploit that over a very long time, and with its relatively strong organisational structure and its genuine popularity, it has benefited over the past few years. The Brotherhood's failure, I think, is also, in retrospect at least, equally logical. The organisation was psychologically unprepared for power. It's almost been structured on permanent opposition. It's been structured, if you like, as in response to occasional acts of repression by government, and so you have them popping their heads up and the government pushes them down. They pop up, and this process has gone on for a very long time. Mohammed Morsi himself was an accidental president. He wasn't the Brotherhood's first choice, and I don't think, again, he was the man for the moment. He was ill-prepared for the rule. In power, the Brotherhood, and Morsi in particular, made mistakes. Some of them, if you like, petty is not the right word, but of relatively minor nature, such as Morsi's refusal to attend the funeral of the Coptic Pope. He could have done that and made a great gesture to a significant part of the population, but he chose not to. Other mistakes they made were much more fundamental in nature. But I make the point, in Egypt, and this is the first time, he was popularly elected. All those people out on the streets, and the media certainly presented an image of vast numbers of people protesting Morsi's rule. But that doesn't justify the overthrow of the popularly elected And I think we're seeing in Ukraine, for example, and in Egypt now, the consequences of such an act. And I think finally Morsi's, well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping a bit, but I think in part Morsi's problem was that he did not understand the attitude of the military, and this was a fatal mistake for him. And I think now we're seeing that coming through to the surface. In February 2011, the Mubarak regime was in a state of terminal decline. The president was not well, he'd lost his grip, his firm grip over power. Change was inevitable. I don't believe that at any stage the military actually considered giving power to the people. It seemed to me that the revolts that occurred in Tahrir Square were convenient for the military. The army saw them as a way of getting rid of Gamal Mubarak, the son of the president, who everybody feared was being groomed for power. We saw that in the months that followed, the military itself wasn't necessarily well equipped for rule, and so people like Field Marshal Tantawi were no more competent than Mubarak had been in his final years. And an internal coup by General Sisi, and a cohort of younger officers gained control. Now, how am I doing with time?
You've got another 10 minutes.
Right. I mentioned at the beginning the distinction between secularism and religion, and I wanted just to touch on this a little bit. I think it is misleading to see this process and the situation in Egypt in religious terms, or in strictly religious terms. First of all, secular does not mean non or anti-religious. Gamal Abdel Nasser was a secular man. No one has ever suggested he was a bad Muslim. President in waiting, al-Sisi, is a very conservative Muslim. And compared to the Muslim Brotherhood, I think he would be considered, if you can have a spectrum in this context, to the right of him. What we are seeing, I believe, is not a battle for Egypt's soul, it's a battle for the material side of Egypt. The military controls anywhere up to 40% of the Egyptian economy. And it is determined to maintain that control. And I think Morsi's problem, when I say he didn't understand the attitude of the military, I think he started to try to touch on some of those sensitive areas, such as control of the Suez Canal, where the military says, no, this is a no-go area. And so that sort of behaviour, that sort of attitude was unacceptable to the military. His removal at their hands coincided, I think, with developments in the region. And just very quickly to touch on these. The implications of the growth, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt were felt right throughout the region. In Jordan, Syria, Gaza, the Emirates, and elsewhere, groups inspired by, connected to the Muslim Brotherhood rose in prominence, gained confidence in their dealings with ruling elites, with regimes. And what we gradually started to see was the emergence of two blocks, if you like. One comprising Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Jordan, and if you like, Israel as an honorary member. They sought to control, to constrain the Brotherhood in their territories. The other, at the time, was Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, and Gaza, trying to promote the organisation, allowing the organisation to assume greater prominence, especially in the Syrian context. The removal of Morsi and the repression of the military, of course, has swung the balance against the Brotherhood. So the clash between these blocks, if you like, has been most apparent in Syria, but it is a central feature, I think, of the domestic politics in Egypt. And I think Egypt is now, if you like, the battlefield, the real battlefield. The response of the military to Morsi and to people protesting at his removal has been given added vehemence by this battle, if you like. The designation of the Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation, the arbitrary arrest of critics, the almost routine resort to torture, the abandonment of the rule of law in a country that prides itself on its adherence to constitutions and law. Creating an environment in which, for members of the Muslim Brotherhood, for supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and others, there are fewer and fewer opportunities for expression, except perhaps violence. So we've seen, it was mentioned earlier, the trial of Al Jazeera's Cairo bureau chief, Fahmy, Peter Gillespie, Australian, and Baha Mohammed. Nothing to do with terrorism or the rule of law, but everything to do with Egypt's military's hostility to Qatar, Saudi's hostility to Qatar, and its perceived support for the Muslim Brotherhood, including through Al Jazeera. The trial that we're still, I think, awaiting of Mohammed Morsi, again, is a politically motivated, an extraordinary exercise of abuse of political power. And of course, not so long ago, we had this sentencing of 522 people for murder, sentencing them to death, some of whom were, one was at least in a wheelchair at the time, others were in jail at the time. Again, here we're seeing the regime resorting to all sorts of measures to suppress the Brotherhood and any opposition. The result has been, instead of what was promised by General Assel, Mr. al-Sisi, instead of the stability, an increase in violence, a marked increase in attacks on government, the tourist sector, security agencies, not just in Sinai, where it's been going on for some time, but in Cairo itself and in other cities. Now, the irony of this is that General al-Sisi, he's no longer in the army, will probably win the elections quite comfortably when eventually they are held. Middle-class people in Egypt, I think, are very concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood. In part because for generations, they've been told to fear them. In part because of the mess that Morsi made of his term in the presidency. But more, I think, Egyptians are very concerned about stability, something that's missed out. Over the years, Egyptian regimes have tended to present themselves as the only thing between the Muslim Brotherhood and chaos. And so we see al-Sisi taking the same approach. Now, I wanted just to jump back again to the Morsi experiment, because it was a disaster. He was a dreadful president. But it had some, I think, very interesting features. And I don't want to overdo it, but I think they are quite important. First of all, I think his approach to politics in Egypt was remarkably democratic. And this was very new in the Egyptian experience. You had a press that was largely free. And we might talk about that in the context of the other country that we're looking at tonight. It was highly irresponsible, but it was free. Demonstrations were largely unfettered, and all political groups really had the chance to establish political movements, political parties to try to run in elections. But even worse from the military's point of view and from the Saudis' point of view was the Ikhwan basically challenged these two groups by calling for freedom and democracy throughout the region. And I think this is the area where the ordinary people in Egypt are really going to suffer, especially in the longer run. We have the full panoply of state power being turned on. People who actually believe in the democratic process. We have the military, the police, the government itself, the judiciary, now joining this movement to crush democratic aspirations. The major target is the Ikhwan and its supporters, but middle-of-the-road reformers are also being caught up in this process. People who only a few months ago were on the streets calling for Morsi's removal are now feeling the sharp edge of the regime's hostility. And, as I said, I think al-Sisi will win the election comfortably. He may be the only serious contender, probably will be. People who voted for him may eventually find themselves regretting that act as well. I think one of the most exciting images to come out of the footage that we saw of Tahrir Square in the early days was young women getting out there, coloured in Egyptian colours, waving banners, and generally carrying on, and having a good time, a lot of them, it looked like. They were out there demanding a degree of recognition that they hadn't enjoyed in the past, hoping that this was going to be a period of change for them. The reaction, I think, was very quick in coming. We started very quickly to hear stories of rape occurring in the square, and that terrible footage that was on television of the young woman having police tearing off her hijab cover, pregnancy tests, which al-Sisi has said he endorses, and things like that. Women have now become almost invisible in the Egyptian political system. Okay. Let me say I've got 2 minutes, so I better speak very quickly. I stress the importance to Egyptians of stability. And that al-Sisi is the man who is going to return them to stability and is going to end the terrorist threat. And that, I think, is what makes him popular. But I don't think his popularity can survive his attempts to halt the ongoing collapse of the Egyptian economy, despite billions of dollars being pumped in by Saudi, and Kuwait, and the Emirates, etc. We're seeing strikes right across the country involving doctors, chemists, all sorts of people demanding improved conditions. We're seeing awful figures in the economy. Unemployment being one of the key issues. So it's about 13.5% at the moment, nobody quite knows. 75% of that are young people. And of those, something like 82% are people with a secondary or tertiary education. Now this is disaster, and it is disastrous for those people themselves, but also for future stability in the country. I think we're going to see continued decline of the economy, and because of constitutional measures that shield the military, that major economic force in the country, from any public scrutiny, we're going to see an increase in corruption, a dramatic increase in corruption. Now, my view is that a regime that is setting itself up in this context and is responding in such a vicious way is incapable of responding with the flexibility and with the imagination necessary to get this sort of economy back on its feet, to get this economy moving in a serious way. I don't believe Egyptians are revolutionaries. I do believe that Egyptians are deeply concerned about the need for change. They want a government that is open to them, is transparent, is accessible. When they have problems, they want to be able to go to someone and seek redress. And in particular, are the young people. And I think their desperation is going to just get worse as the years go on. And I think in that point I better stop.